Oral tradition and oral law is cultural material and tradition transmitted orally from one generation to another. The messages or testimony are verbally transmitted in speech or song and may take the form, for example, of folktales, sayings, ballads, songs, or chants. In this way, it is possible for a society to transmit oral history, oral literature, oral law and other knowledges across generations without a writing system. A narrower definition of oral tradition is sometimes appropriate. Sociologists might also emphasize a requirement that the material is held in common by a group of people, over several generations, and might distinguish oral tradition from testimony or oral history. In a general sense, oral tradition refers to the transmission of cultural material through vocal utterance, and was long held to be a key descriptor of folklore. As an academic discipline, it refers both to a set of objects of study and a method by which they are studied. The method may be called variously oral traditional theory, the theory of oral-formulaic composition, and the Parry-Lord theory. The study of oral tradition is distinct from the academic discipline of oral history, which is the recording of personal memories and histories of those who experienced historical eras or events. It is also distinct from the study of orality, which can be defined as thought and its verbal expression in societies where the technologies of literacy are unfamiliar to most of the population. Study of oral tradition. History. The following overview draws upon oral formulaic theory and research, an introduction and annotated bibliography. Additional material is summarized from the overlapping prefaces to the following volumes: The Theory of Oral Composition, History and Methodology. Immanent Art, From Structure to Meaning in Traditional Oral Epic. The Singer of Tales in Performance and Comparative Research on Oral Traditions, a memorial for Milman Parry. In the work of the Serb scholar Vuk Stefanović Rada 3/4 year, a contemporary and friend of the Brothers Grimm. Vuk pursued similar projects of salvage folklore and cognate traditions of the southern Slavic regions which would later be gathered into Yugoslavia, and with the same admixture of romantic and nationalistic interests. Somewhat later, but as part of the same scholarly enterprise of nationalist studies in folklore, the tautologist Vasily Radlov would study the songs of the Kara Kyrgyz in what would later become the Soviet Union. Karadzic and Radlov would provide models for the work of Parry. Walter. In a separate development, the media theorist Marshall McLuhan would begin to focus attention on the ways that communicative media shape the nature of the content conveyed. He would serve as mentor to the Jesuit, Walter, whose interests in cultural history, psychology and rhetoric would result in orality and literacy and the important but less-known Fighting for Life, Contest, Sexuality and Consciousness. These two works articulated the contrasts between cultures defined by primary orality, writing, print, and the secondary orality of the electronic age. On's works also made possible an integrated theory of oral tradition which accounted for both production of content and its reception. This approach, like McLuhan's, kept the field open not just to the study of aesthetic culture but to the way physical and behavioral artifacts of oral societies are used to store, manage and transmit knowledge, so that oral tradition provides methods for investigation of cultural differences, other than the purely verbal, between oral and literate societies. The most often studied section of orality and literacy concerns the psychodynamics of orality. This chapter seeks to define the fundamental characteristics of primary orality and summarizes a series of descriptors which might be used to index the relative orality or literacy of a given text or society. John Miles Foley. In advance of On synthesis, John Miles Foley, who studied with Robert Creed, began a series of papers based on his own field work on South Slavic oral genres, emphasizing the dynamics of performers and audiences. Foley effectively consolidated oral tradition as an academic field, when he compiled Oral Formulaic Theory and Research in 1985. The bibliography gives a summary of the progress scholars made in evaluating the oral tradition up to that point, and includes a list of all relevant scholarly articles relating to the theory of oral-formulaic composition. He also established both the journal Oral Tradition and founded the Center for Studies in Oral Tradition at the University of Missouri. Foley developed oral theory beyond the somewhat mechanistic notions presented in earlier versions of oral formulaic theory, by extending On's interest in cultural features of oral societies beyond the verbal, by drawing attention to the agency of the bard and by describing how oral traditions bear meaning. The bibliography would establish a clear underlying methodology which accounted for the findings of scholars working in the separate linguistics fields. Perhaps more importantly, it would stimulate conversation among these specialities, so that a network of independent but allied investigations and investigators could be established. Foley's key works include the theory of oral composition, immanent art, traditional oral epic, the Odyssey, Beowulf and the Serbo-Croatian return song, the singer of tales in performance, teaching oral traditions, how to read an oral poem. His Pathways project draws parallels between the media dynamics of oral traditions and the Internet. Acceptance and further elaboration. The theory of oral tradition would undergo elaboration and development as it grew in acceptance. While the number of formulas documented for various traditions proliferated, the concept of the formula remained lexically bound. However, numerous innovations appeared, such as the formulaic system with structural substitution slots for syntactic, morphological and narrative necessity. Sophisticated models such as Foley's word type placement rules followed. Higher levels of formulaic composition were defined over the years, such as ring composition, responsion, and the type scene. Examples include the beasts of battle, and the cliffs of death. Some of these characteristic patterns of narrative details would show evidence of global distribution. At the same time, the fairly rigid division between oral and literate was replaced by recognition of transitional and compartmentalized texts and societies, including models of diglossia. Perhaps most importantly, the terms and concepts of orality and literacy came to be replaced with the more useful and apt traditionality and textuality. Very large units would be defined and areas outside of military epic would come under investigation, women's song, riddles and other genres. The methodology of oral tradition now conditions a large variety of studies, not only in folklore, literature and literacy, but in philosophy, communication theory, semiotics, and including a very broad and continually expanding variety of languages and ethnic groups, and perhaps most conspicuously in biblical studies, in which Werner Kelber has been especially prominent. The annual bibliography is indexed by 100 areas, most of which are ethno-linguistic divisions. Present developments explore the implications of the theory for rhetoric and composition, interpersonal communication, cross-cultural communication, post-colonial studies, rural community development, 5, popular culture and film studies, 6, and many other areas. The most significant areas of theoretical development at present may be the construction of systematic hermeneutics and aesthetics specific to oral traditions. Process: oral cultures face a few unique obstacles when passing down information. Without the use of writing systems to transmit information through time, oral cultures employ various strategies that serve similar purposes to writing. For example, heavily rhythmic speech filled with mnemonic devices enhances memory and recall. A few useful mnemonic devices include alliteration, repetition, assonance, and proverbial sayings. These strategies help facilitate transmission of information from individual to individual without a written intermediate, and they can also be applied to oral governance. Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book provides an excellent demonstration of oral governance in The Law of the Jungle. Not only does grounding rules in oral proverbs allow for simple transmission and understanding, but it also legitimizes new rulings by allowing extrapolation. These stories, traditions, and proverbs are not static, but are often altered upon each transmission barring the overall meaning remains intact. In this way, the rules that govern the people are modified by the whole and not authored by a single entity. Criticism and debates. The theory of oral tradition encountered early resistance from scholars who perceived it as potentially supporting either one side or another in the controversy between what were known as Unitarians, and analysts that is, scholars who believed Homer to have been a single, historical figure, and those who saw him as a conceptual author function, a convenient name to assign to what was essentially a repertoire of traditional narrative. A much more general dismissal of the theory and its implications simply described it as unprovable. Some scholars, mainly outside the field of oral tradition, represent this body of theoretical work as reducing the great epics to children's party games like telephone, or Chinese whispers. While games provide amusement by showing how messages distort content via uncontextualized transmission, Parry's supporters argue that the theory of oral tradition reveals how oral methods optimize the signal-to-noise ratio and thus improve the quality, stability and integrity of content transmission. There were disputes concerning particular findings of the theory. For example, those trying to support or refute Ground's hypothesis found the hero on the beach formula in numerous Old English poems. It was also discovered in other works of Germanic origin, Middle English poetry, and even an Icelandic prose saga. J. A. Dane, in an article characterized as Polemics Without Rigor, claimed that the appearance of the theme in ancient Greek poetry, a tradition without known connection to the Germanic, invalidated the notion of an autonomous theme in the baggage of an oral poet. Within Homeric studies specifically, Lord's The Singer of Tales, which focused on problems and questions that arise in conjunction with applying oral formulaic theory to problematic texts such as the Iliad, Odyssey, and even Beowulf, influenced nearly all of the articles written on Homer and oral formulaic composition thereafter. However, in response to Lord, Geoffrey Kirk published The Songs of Homer, questioning Lord's extension of the oral formulaic nature of Serbian and Croatian literature to Homeric epic. Kirk argues that Homeric poems differ from those traditions in their metrical strictness, formula system, and creativity. In other words, Kirk argued that Homeric poems were recited under a system that gave the reciter much more freedom to choose words and passages to get to the same end than the Serbo-Croatian poet, who was merely reproductive. Shortly thereafter, Eric Havelock's preface to Plato revolutionized how scholars looked at Homeric epic by arguing not only that it was the product of an oral tradition, but also that the oral formulas contained therein served as a way for ancient Greeks to preserve cultural knowledge across many different generations. Adam Parry, in his 1966 work Have We Homer's Iliad?, theorized the existence of the most fully developed oral poet to his time, a person who could creatively and intellectually create nuanced characters in the context of the accepted, traditional story. In fact, he discounted the Serbo-Croatian tradition to an unfortunate extent, choosing to elevate the Greek model of oral tradition above all others. Lord reacted to Kirk's and Parry's essays with Homer as oral poet, published in 1968. Which reaffirmed Lord's belief in the relevance of Yugoslav poetry and its similarities to Homer and downplayed the intellectual and literary role of the reciters of Homeric epic. Many of the criticisms of the theory have been absorbed into the evolving field as useful refinements and modifications. For example, in what Foley called a pivotal contribution, Larry Benson introduced the concept of written formulaic to describe the status of some Anglo-Saxon poetry which, while demonstrably written, contains evidence of oral influences, including heavy reliance on formulas and themes. A number of individual scholars in many areas continue to have misgivings about the applicability of the theory or the aptness of the South Slavic comparison, and particularly what they regard as its implications for the creativity which may legitimately be attributed to the individual artist. However, at present, there seems to be little systematic or theoretically coordinated challenge to the fundamental tenets of the theory. As Foley put it, there have been numerous suggestions for revisions or modifications of the theory, but the majority of controversies have generated further understanding. See also, American Indian Elder, Folk Process, Hadith, Intangible Culture, Oral History, Oral Law, Oral Literature, Oral Torah, Oral Tradition Journal, Oral-Formulaic Composition, Orality, Parampara, Patha, Shrauta, Secondary Orality, Traditional Knowledge, Understanding Media, World Oral Literature Project. References. External links, Back to the Oral Tradition, the Center for Studies in Oral Tradition, the Milman-Parry Collection of Oral Literature Online, Oral Tradition Journal, the World Oral Literature Project, Post-Gutenberg Galaxy, the Copyright Darlow Project. open software platform for management of intangible cultural heritage and oral history, Archive of Turkish Oral Narrative at Texas Tech University.